When was the last time you changed your mind about something you thought was important? Try to think of something that perhaps you always took for granted. Maybe marriage is between a man and a woman. Or, I will only ever vote for a Democrat, just like my family always has. Maybe it was only men should really be ordained. A woman's place is in the home. Or only Episcopalians will go to heaven. Okay, I doubt many Episcopalians ever really thought that. It strikes me today, though, that our readings suggest the need for mind changing, or at least they point out our resistance to changing our minds. Those poor Israelites. It will take them a generation to shift their mindset from slavery in Egypt and dependence on its comforts, those flesh pots and that water, and the security they had there, such as they were. It would take a generation for them to imagine themselves, to change their mind so they understood themselves to be the free people of God. That mindset was so stubborn that, as the story goes, the whole generation, all of those who'd lived in Egypt, had to die off before Israel could enter the promised land. And that even included their great leader, Moses. Today in the gospel, Jesus' temple opponents, at least in Jesus' imagination, are suffering from the same problem. Jesus has just attacked the temple economy. In the story before this one, which we didn't hear today, he invaded the temple area, overturned the temples, and disrupted the temple marketplace. And in doing so, revealed how corrupt it was, how it took advantage of the people that came there to worship. But those priests he's arguing with today, they can't imagine it any other way. How else are good Jews supposed to worship God, except by sacrificing in the temple and enriching the priests and the Roman overlords in the process through the marketplace where people bought the food they sacrificed? Perhaps you can almost hear those priests saying something we might have heard before, but we've always done it that way. That's how God wants it. Now, I don't think we contemporary U.S. citizens are any more immune than those temple priests from this resistance to changing our minds. Consider how hardened our politics has become. I read this week that nearly 90% of Americans already know who they're going to vote for in the next election for president. And while we might have to say this election might be a bit more unusual, our politics has for some time seemed little affected any longer by ideas or policies or facts on the ground. More and more, it's now become a question of which tribe one belongs to, whether political or racial or cultural, and not necessarily what's best for the common good, which one might hope would drive an election. I could not help but notice this kind of hardened, taken for granted attitude at work in our society as I read news from Kentucky regarding the charges against police officers whose forced entry into an apartment and ensuing gunfire led to the death of Breonna Taylor. Setting aside for a moment the ins and outs of grand juries and no-knock warrants, and even the systemic racism embedded in our legal system, no one seems to question the knee-jerk resort to violence that led to Breonna's death. Officers who broke down a front door and invaded a home. Taylor's own boyfriend, who immediately drew a gun and fired without asking any questions. The police who then responded in kind with violence rather than withdrawing. and one of whom actually went outside and started shooting blindly into a window. The only action that was charged just because it was so random. But the fundamental attitude that violence is the action of first resort, shoot first, ask questions later, remains unexamined. And I don't know about you, but I find that attitude deeply embedded in our culture, all over our media, on television shows and movies. And to me, it's akin to a societal mental health crisis. And it resulted in Breonna Taylor's death, an innocent woman. Our society is in need of a profound change of mind. How many other unexamined attitudes are diminishing the lives of our siblings and friends and fellow citizens, including killing some of them? How do we, and I'm talking about each of us individually here, need to change our minds, experience a conversion that might turn us in new directions, from exclusion to inclusion, from competition against one another to care for the common good, from fear of scarcity to trust in God's abundance. Now, while that particular example of Louisville, Kentucky may not seem at first to have a religious ring to it, I think the question of changing our minds is, at least for those of us who follow Jesus, always a religious one. Jesus' attack on the temple was meant to reveal how corrupt it had become, because it and those who governed it had not changed and refused to do so. The religious practices of the temple at that time perpetuated the power of the Romans and of the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem, further impoverishing and cheating already poor people who just wanted to practice their faith. This just wasn't a question about piety. It was a question about justice and the changes of mind and heart required to make that happen. And that is the problem with things that do not change. They become moribund, no longer doing what they're meant to do, or even worse, in the case of the temple, they start to do the opposite of what they're meant to do. Instead of nurturing the freedom of God's people so hard won in that desert, the temple of Jesus' day was perpetuating their slavery to the temple priests and to the Roman occupiers. An encounter with the living God of the desert had become its opposite, idol worship at the service of the powers that be. I do not think for a second that our own Christian faith and practice is in any less danger of such failures. So, as Jesus asked, what do you think? What in us resists that change of mind and keeps us stuck in the way we've always done it? I mean this particularly as a question for St. Simon's here on the edge of a new moment in your own ministry. How might this temple and its practice need to change as you and Jenny begin your walk together? I ask because I am convinced that to be in relationship with the living God is to be constantly changing, or at least constantly open to change, to changing our minds, lest we get stuck in a cul-de-sac that no longer brings us or anyone else the life that God wants to give us. That kind of change is at the heart of conversion. That's the meaning of conversion, as difficult as it can sometimes be. As one of my favorite theologians, John Henry Newman, once said, "In a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. How must we get ready to change our minds so that we can continue on our own journey toward God's promised land?